We'll begin the connective tissues by looking at the types of connective tissues and the properties of connective tissues. The main types of connective tissues are the fibrous connective tissues, the cartilages, and finally bone and blood. So let's look at properties of connective tissues and discuss those. So the major functions of connective tissues, as their name implies, is to connect, but they also have additional roles as well. So connective tissues function to bind and support, they function to protect and insulate, and they also function in some capacity in storing things. So from this we get a really good diversity of functions, and we'll see that we have a really good diversity of connective tissues as well. So recall that the epithelial tissues were avascular, that is, they lacked blood vessels. In connective tissues, there is a range of vascularization, that is, we have a range of how many blood vessels are present within the connective tissues. So some connective tissues, like the bones and the fibrous connective tissues, for the most part tend to be quite well vascularized, so they have a very rich blood supply that delivers nutrients to them. While other connective tissues, like the cartilages, tend to be avascular in a pretty similar way that the epithelial tissues were. So we get this huge range in vascularization with connective tissues. So all connective tissues contain a substance called the extracellular matrix. And what we're going to see is that the connective tissues are incredibly diverse in their structure and function. And much of that diversity is due to this extracellular, the composition of this extracellular matrix. Now, the extracellular matrix is a protein or fibrous material coupled with a gel-like fluid that exists between the cells of the connective tissue. So that is, these protein fibers and this gel-like material exist between the cells of connective tissues. The extracellular matrix can be anywhere from soft and flexible to hard and tough, and so that's where we get a lot of the diversity in both structure and function of our connective tissues, is from the composition of this extracellular matrix here. In addition to having this extracellular matrix component, another property of connective tissues is that all connective tissues arise from the same embryonic connective tissue. That is, they all have the same embryonic origin. And that embryonic origin is a connective tissue called mesenchyme, and mesenchyme is an embryonic connective tissue that's, we're going to see, is going to give rise to all the other connective tissues that we see in the adult human body. Right? All connective tissues have three components. So they have cells. So in order to be a tissue, it has to have cells, so no surprise here. So we see there's a cellular component with the connective tissues, just like we'll see with any of the other tissue types. So we have cells, but we also have this extracellular matrix, and the extracellular matrix is composed of these two substances here, the ground substance and the protein fibers. Now, the ground substance is a gel-like fluid that exists between the cells of the connective tissue. The fibers are the rope or the filament-like proteins that are contained within this ground substance here. So we collectively refer to the ground substance and the fibers, we collectively refer to that, the mixture of those two things, as the extracellular matrix. So when we're talking about extracellular matrix, we're talking about these two things as a mixture of substances. We'll discuss what this ground substance and protein fibers are here in the next few minutes here. So as I mentioned earlier, the composition or the type of ground substance and the proportion of cells to ground substance to fibers gives the connective tissues a huge diversity. So if we play with if the body kind of plays with the ratios or plays with the composition of the ground substance or the fibers, then the body can really dramatically alter the properties of that connective tissue and give it a really great diversity. And so that's why we see a huge diversity in the connective tissues, is because each of these three components can be configured in a different way, and that gives the connective tissue different properties. Let's focus on the cells for a minute, because we got a couple of different cell types. within the connective tissues. So the primary cell type that we're going to see in the connective tissues is a cell type called the fibroblast. And fibroblasts are a type of cell that, as their name implies with the word fibro in it, that these are the cells that are creating the fibers as well as the extracellular matrix of connective tissues. And so these are the cells that are really building that non-living material that's found between the cells. So we've got fibroblasts here. This group of 4 cells right here, the neutrophils, eosinophils, lymphocytes, and mast cells, these are all cells that are responsible for immune system responses. And so that we see that these cells will have immune system roles within connective tissues. We see a great number of immune system roles in connective tissues because connective tissues are always directly underneath epithelial tissues. So that is, if microorganisms or dirt and debris or even any damage occurs to the epithelial tissues, or if any microorganisms or dirt or debris get past the epithelial tissues, those microorganisms and dirt and debris will encounter the immune system cells of the connective tissue that's right underneath the epithelial tissue. And so for that reason, because epithelial tissues always have a connective tissue underneath, we usually see that a lot of connective tissues have cells that deal with immune system responses and roles. We also see adipocytes, which are fat cells that store a type of lipid called a triglyceride. Triglycerides can be used in a couple of different ways. They can be used to serve as a protective material. That is, adipocytes tend to be full of these triglycerides, and that makes them soft and kind of compressible, and so they serve in protecting us from any kind of trauma, that is physical trauma. We also see that adipocytes, the triglycerides in adipocytes, are really good heat insulators, so that's why we have a layer of adipose tissue generally directly beneath the skin, because that helps to insulate against heat loss. And the triglycerides can also be metabolized to create ATP, so as our blood glucose starts to change, we can metabolize some of those triglycerides to get some ATP from. So I've actually placed a document on Moodle that elaborates on the functions of all of these cells as well, particularly the immune system cells, since these are 4 different cell types here. Each one of them does have a specific role in the immune system. And I've put a document on Moodle in the Chapter 4 material that kind of highlights some general roles of all of these cell types here. So please refer to that, and that will give you a little bit more detail about these cell types and what they're doing. So moving on from cell types, let's look at the second component of the connective tissues, which is the ground substance. And the ground substance contains 3 things. It contains interstitial or tissue fluid. So this is a fluid that fills the space between the cells of all tissues, not just connective tissues. However, connective tissues contain a number of other substances like proteins and fibers within that tissue fluid there. The ground substance not only contains the fluid to give it its watery properties, it also contains a number of cell adhesion proteins, and these serve as the connective tissue glue that helps the cells of the connective tissue bind to the extracellular matrix of that connective tissue. So this is really helping the cells of the connective tissue stick to the extracellular matrix that we see in the connective tissues. We also see a type of glycoprotein called a Proteoglycan, and this is a glycoprotein, so that is, it is a protein with sugar molecules or carbohydrates that stick off of it. Specifically, this is a type of glycoprotein with long chains of polysaccharides, that is, many chains of sugars that are attached to one another. And these proteoglycans serve to trap water, and so that gives the ground substance a watery to gel-like consistency. So in some connective tissues like the cartilage, this gel is really hardened, almost like a really almost kind of like a bone-like hardness in some cartilages. While in other connective tissues, the gel that's formed from these proteoglycans is a really soft and spongy-like material. So kind of the basic structure of a proteoglycan is that off of these long chains of molecules called hyaluronins, you have these core proteins that are kind of in this these little short oranges type brown structures here. And these core proteins then have these little branches of polysaccharides that are attached to it. And so these core proteins with the polysaccharides that are called glycosaminoglycans that come off of it like little branches, these are collectively referred to as the proteoglycans. So these, depending on the number and the number of glycosaminoglycans, that can help to change the consistency of this gel-like fluid. So connective tissues have a way to change their overall structure by altering what these proteoglycans, by altering essentially the type of proteoglycan that they make. Okay, so we've looked at ground substance, and we've also looked at the cells of connective tissues. So recall that all connective tissues contain this extracellular matrix, and so we've gone through the components of that. Recall also here that all connective tissues arise from an embryonic connective tissue called mesenchyme. Now, mesenchyme is really only present in the embryo, and so this is a photomicrograph of what mesenchyme looks like. So we see some sparse cells in it called mesenchymal cells. The mesenchyme has a gel-like ground substance associated with it and some protein fibers in it as well. So it has the basic components of all of the connective tissues in the body that we see. So let's start to look at functions here before we look at specific connective tissues here. So of course the connective tissues bind and connect the body's other tissues together. And so a good example of this are the tendons and ligaments. So tendons help connect skeletal muscles to the bones of the skeleton. Ligaments help connect bones to other bones. So that's a good example of connective tissues that serve in that binding and connecting function. Connective tissues also support and protect. And a good example of this is bone, because bone is the bones of the skeleton, serve as our internal support framework, and they also serve to protect and support soft organs. So, for example, the skull supports and protects the soft nervous tissue that makes up the brain. And so we see that connective tissues function in support and protection as well. But they also serve in capacities like storage and heat production. So as far as storage is concerned, bones store calcium and phosphate minerals, so bones serve as a mineral storage. And indeed what we see is that the body can liberate calcium and phosphate from the skeleton when we need to put calcium and phosphate into the blood. And kind of on the other side of that is when we have too much calcium and phosphate within our blood, we can deposit that within the skeleton. And so we see that the bones act kind of like a bank where we can make withdrawals and deposits of calcium and phosphate as the rest of our body needs it. In terms of storage as well, adipose tissue stores those lipids called triglycerides, and triglycerides are a great insulator against heat loss. They provide a protective cushioning as well as energy storage, because we can metabolize triglycerides to make ATP. And finally, in wrapping up with the functions of connective tissues, we see that some connective tissues are used in a limited capacity to produce heat, but this is only true in infants. Now, infants have a special type of fat or adipose tissue called brown fat. And brown fat is called brown fat because it has a high number of mitochondria in it, giving it kind of a yellowish brown appearance. And so when brown fat metabolizes the triglycerides and the lipids that it stores, brown fat produces heat rather than ATP energy. And so there, that wraps up the functions of our connective tissue.